Trinket by J.R. Henry. He stumbled through a sudden opening in the forest brush onto a beach he'd never known. His boots greeted the sand awkwardly, throwing the white powder up into his pants and throwing him off balance. His hand shielded his eyes from the sudden bronze brightness, and he peered west across the water. The water! His brain reeled, refusing to process the glimmering surface, the fine white sand in his boots, the smell of salt and life. The water itself was anomalous. It could perhaps be a flood, but the beach? Plain impossible. The sea was 100 miles north of home, yet here it was, stretching south, a narrowing finger over the bogs and into the forest. The boy placed his boots on a large rock to mark his path, rolled up his pants, and began barefoot southward along the unexpected arm of water. As he walked, he became aware of golden-green foliage strewn about the edges of the beach. The fine white sand was like any beach he'd seen on the sea to the north, littered with boulders and driftwood, but not these vines, deep green cords woven within golden seaweed. His brain, no longer reeling, asked his feet to follow the vines. He continued south along the narrow beach, white powder caking between his toes. As the sun approached the tops of the maples to the west across the water, he came upon a point where some of the vines converged, a nodule, a cluster of the golden weed with roots in the sand and a bloom the color and quality of a dying sun, searing yellow-orange in deep red petals radiating upward like individual flames, iridescent in their own daytime glow. He knelt by the bronze blossom, illogically disappointed that it gave no heat. He leaned in to catch the flower's scent, but even with the deepest inhalation found it gave off no aroma. Puzzled, the boy stood, staring down into the spiraling bloom. His gaze then followed one of the vines emerging from the cluster further south along the beach, and he noticed more of these flowers. He decided he would take a blossom home as proof of this strange afternoon, but his feet continued south. The vines became thicker, the flowers more frequent, and the boy's imagination more inflamed as he pressed south. Vines and blossoms brushing his ankles, sandy white and bronze daylight, the smell of salt and life. And then, right before him, adorned by the flickering blossoms, sat a makeshift platform, a heap of driftwood with metallic veins shimmering through each log. Here was the convergence of the green-gold cables, thatched through the driftwood in knots and tangles that so distracted his eye, he had barely noticed the woman reclining among the logs and vines. Innately concerned, and even more curious, the boy approached the platform. The old woman lifted her head in his direction, her wet, white hair tangled in the golden foliage. Her eyes were glazed and dark, like smoked opal. He almost spoke. Words skittered across the lips of his mind, but none yet found air. Instead, his perplexed thighs found rest on the log at the edge of the platform, and, with a sigh, he tried to gain his bearings. The sun, leaning west behind the trees, shone in bronze about the beach. Among the ornately etched gold-veined logs and thatch of vines glittered a trove of trinkets, small brass cups, silvery keys, bits of shimmering stones, strips of fine chainmail. His eyes went wide, and the boy looked once again at the old woman, whose head lay back on its pillow of green and gold, without apparent stress or concern. He picked up a clear crystal orb the size of a walnut and examined it, holding it up to the remaining sunlight across the unexplainable inlet. It was nearly flawless. He peered deeper into the marble and realized it showed no reflection of the water. No, when he looked into the marble, he saw reflected and refracted the image only of a forest. Bewildered, his eyes snapped back to the old woman, and he started. Sitting now, the woman grinned whimsically at the boy with sharp green eyes. His hands went cold, his legs felt heavy, and he choked on his own breath. The old woman's grin softened, and she calmly held a spindly hand aloft, motioning for the marble. The boy gave it to her, and her soft green gaze was lost in the orb. She adorned the marble with loving eyes, as though it was a piece of herself she'd never imagined parting with. before looking back to the boy. Silently, she reached out with the marble, a gift between her narrow thumb and forefingers. He reached out, yearning for the marble, a prize between his thumb and forefingers. One from another, to the other for one, for the old from the young, and the young for the aged. The girl released the marble, and the old man's gaze went opal once again. He replaced the perfect marble in its bag, and the bag of marbles in a pocket of his terry-cloth robe, and shuffled away barefoot, just as he'd come, fine white powder caked between his toes. Her green eyes followed him north, curious what he was looking for or why he was headed toward the old mines, but the old man never looked back to her. She turned her gaze west, toward home. There was just enough sunlight to make it back around the inlet before dark. Remembering the reflection in that old man's perfect marble, deep in the bronze salt of life, she molded another tower for her sand castle.